Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a busy last couple of days. We're heavily into everything on the front end of the Farmall H because we're still waiting on word from the machine shop on the cylinder head, and I don't want to touch the engine until I know which direction that's going to go, because that may influence what I end up doing to the rest of the engine. So in the meantime, well, we are heavily into front end, front wheels. You can see I've got the tires dismounted from the rims. I wanted to put some new inner tubes in them. These were not leaking, had never given me any problems, but they're getting on 15 years old now. It was just time for a change. I also took this opportunity to clean the rims, prepping them for the new silver paint on the external surfaces. I've got some heavy Rust-Oleum primer, 2 coats on the inside surfaces, just to make sure we don't have any rust forming in there that could give us any problems with any of the new inner tubes that are going in. So while those dry outside in the sun, we look at wheel hubs, we look at bearings, we look at pedestal and spindle. Eventually we'll work our way into the bolster. We won't get anything done with that in this episode, but it's next up on the list. So with the front wheels all apart, I then moved on to the spindle and the wheel centers, bearings, grease seals, and the like. I knew from the last time I was into the front of this tractor that there were some real issues with a lot of those components, but at the time they were deemed to be good enough for one more go around. It's come due. The time is here to make it all right. So here are a few things that I knew from before that was going on with the front end of the H. At one point in time, before my grandfather had even got this tractor, they had a problem with the front wheel bolts running very loose. And you can see how they ran loose for so long, they cut recesses around all those through holes, and they hogged the holes way out. This one had not been repaired. Someone did try to braze repair this one, and well, the best we did at the time was just throw some large flat washers beneath the heads of those bolts that could kind of cradle in these recesses. It worked well enough because this tractor did not have a loader on it, so it was only supporting the weight of the machine itself. But one of these, yeah, right here, you can see where it had actually broken out and came all the way through. They had to braze that back closed again. That one was okay. That one was, yeah, this one was through as well. So I decided these were not worth pursuing any further. So I knocked all the bearings and seals out of these. I think they're destined for the scrap pile. Then we moved on to the pedestal with the spindles, and I didn't find much better here. This side had an inner wheel bearing failure at one point in time that I think was allowed to go quite a while because the rim had actually kicked into the point it started cutting a groove in the side of the pedestal housing itself. But this inner race has spun on the spindle to the point where we've got about a 15 thousandths step right there where it actually chewed into the spindle itself. So the spindle portion for sure is shot now because you're never going to keep a bearing tight on that worn area. Also, as evidenced by the inside of the grease cap, lots of scarring going on in there. I also pulled part of an old bearing roller cage out of that wheel hub on that side. It had an aftermarket replacement inner bearing in it, but it looks like I think they just left the old bearing race in there because judging by the grooves and the damage to this, well, it doesn't match what they did with the bearing. So I'm pretty sure they just bought just a new bearing, threw it in on top of that old race, and called her good. These bearings are also supposed to have kind of grease catchers behind them. The inner one was gone. The outer one was mangled almost beyond recognition. So yeah, you can see also this cap had run loose enough that the end of the spindle had actually started wearing on it from the inside. This other cap had had a failure much the same. I wasn't impressed with anything that came out of the front end of the H. Here now is where having parts manuals and parts tractors come in extremely handy. We had an old flogged out Farmall 300 around. Here's H, here's 300, okay? that we decided we were going to use for parts. I got into the book, started doing my homework, and determined we had enough good 300 parts to do a complete Farmall H to 300 front wheel pedestal hub upgrade, and everything would work just fine. I crossed all of the bearings, the seals, the grease caps. All of the inner workings are the same. The 300 had grease caps that were much better. The outer bearings and races from the 300 were good. The inners had suffered a bit, so we got new ones of those. The bearing is a Timken 14138A. The race is a Timken 14274. Grease seals are all the same between 300 and H. Picked these up from Steiner Tractor. And the 300 also had all 4 of the grease retainers that go behind the bearings intact, and a couple just needed a few minor dents taken out, but for the most part all that was really good. So we're fixed up there. The front pedestal casting is actually the same. They're both the 6688-DDs, all right? The date code is going to be a little bit off for a 45. That's not bothering me. The front wheel centers, critical dimensions are all the same for the weights, for the bolt pattern for the wheels, and we're shaped just a little bit differently. The original H ones had kind of this recess that went in right here, where the 300s are a little bit thicker, and it's actually pronounced a little bit. But aside from that, everything's going to work. The only real difference between these is the thread pitch on the spindles. All right, so the 300 has a much finer thread pitch. Farmall H is a lot coarser. So what we have to do is discard the original coarse thread Farmall H wheel bearing nuts. Now these were the ones that utilized the cotter pin plus the pinch bolt, and we will go with the updated 300 wheel bearing nuts, which consists of a super heavy flat washer and a finer thread nut to match that uses cotter pin only. Lastly, to round things out, I wanted to make sure the attaching hardware for the front wheel weight sets, which you can see are all prepped for painting and they're on their legs. I wanted to make sure all that attaching hardware was going to work with these updated 300 front hubs. So once again, back to the parts manuals. And guys, I know I harp on this a lot, but if you're going to be doing this kind of work, you can't get by without this information. So we take a look at the old square-headed wheel weight bolts that came with that set of weights, and turns out these are the Farmall H bolts, and they are indeed different than what is required for the 300. I love these manuals because it gives you like machine bolt 1/2 inch by 2 inches long, coarse thread. You know exactly what you need just by what's listed in here. And sure enough, because of the slightly thicker flange area of these Farmall 300 wheel centers, well, the standard 2-inch long Farmall H bolt was not going to work. These hubs require a 2 3/8 inch long square-headed bolt. So luckily McMaster-Carr had exactly what I needed. Threw in an order, 6 of those showed up, complete set for hardware. Having those books got us out of a jam, avoided a potential problem. All right, there's the first 300 wheel center. So we'll start loading the bearing race, the outer one, with the grease deflector. And when I knocked all these apart, you can see there's that notch right there and a notch right there. They give you that on both sides, right there and right there for the back, for the inside one. They give you that so you can access the back side of the bearing race, and you can even see the punch marks in the grease deflector, because when they're all stacked in there like that, you have to hit the back of that deflector to drive both out at the same time. So the dish on these always insets toward the inside. So the little grease catch goes in first. Then we can take this outer race, drive it right down in on top of it. That's looking good. Washer's nice and tight beneath the race, so we flip it over, do the same thing for the inner bearing. So we've got the offset dish, once again, goes in. Position that down towards the bottom. And the new bearing race then will drive in on top of it. Good. Next we have this tin sleeve that gets driven in above the bearing race. When you drive that bearing race out, it takes this along with it. But this is the same for H as well as 300, same piece. And this is what the grease seal actually engages with, all right? The rubber lips on the outside of that seal go up against the inside of this, this sleeve. So usually a pretty easy install as well. Easy as that. The grease seal now gets driven onto the spindle, and here is a difference between H and 300. So H had a felt ring that went on first, kind of as a dust catcher, and then that seal. The 300 manual states that if you're using that triple-lipped rubber seal, which this is, that you then delete that felt ring. And what I usually do to drive these on, I use this old bearing race because it fits just inside of it, kind of in that counterbore right there. So I can use that as a driver in conjunction with this long piece of pipe. Goes over the end of the spindle, drives it on just fine. So with the grease seal on, I slid the inner bearing on, and I've greased up the lip of the seal really well as the inside of the sleeve here where the seal is going to engage, because they do require some lubrication, otherwise you'll just you'll burn the lip right off that seal. So slide the wheel center / hub on, and we need to get it started. There we are, started in the seal. Very good. Outer bearing goes in now. I'll get a little bit of grease on that heavy washer. And the nut. Adjusting wheel bearings, it's kind of a feel, all right? I've done it most of my life. It's hard to explain. You'll know when you get it there. Practice helps a lot too. So we'll pin it. Yeah, we're good. No drag, no play. That's what you want. Now the grease cap with the gasket stuck to the back side of it. The dent-free grease cap at that. We can seal this one up, call it done. So we did all the same things to the hub on the other side. Next, I'm going to take the vertical steering shaft. All right, this is what goes in the bolster. And for painting purposes, I'm going to bolt this onto the pedestal on the 4-bolt flange right there. Not a lot to talk about on this one. This shaft was in pretty good shape, so I've got it masked where I don't want paint to go. And here is the thrust bearing. When I peel all the masking off, you'll see it, but the thrust bearing, and this is a like a stamped tin retainer where there's a felt dust seal ring inside of that. I redid all of that stuff the last time I was in the tractor, and it's still just fine now. Cleaned it up a little bit, masked it, and we're good to go. So when we put this on, we have this key slot right here that faces forward. In this application, it doesn't matter because the cultivator attachments that would clamp to that and stick out through the grill for steering purposes had the key on the front. We don't run cultivator attachments, so this could go on any one of the 4 ways, but right, correct, and proper, key slot faces to the front. Swagger, here's another train. They're just taunting me out there. I'd rather be here doing this anyway. We've got one special bolt with that raised cap on it. That goes on the right front. You can tell the front by this extra 2-bolt flange that sticks out. And this bolt ends up being the travel stop that hits the abutment that's on the bottom side of the steering bolster. So it's critical to get that positioned in the right spot. So I've got it hung up. The bolts are tight, of course. We're hung up on the cherry picker because this is going to be the easiest way to paint this with the hubs and the spindle and everything. And I usually paint the bolster with the vertical shaft already in it. But I'm waiting on a bushing kit because we are worn on the bushing up here and we are very worn on the bushing down there. Shaft itself is in really good condition and the bolster seems to be in good condition. So once that kit shows up, we'll get that rebushed and then we will paint that separate and then carefully assemble all that into it. In the meantime, I did get the PTO shield cleaned up and fitted today. We're just trying to round out a paint batch. I'm not going to have a whole lot of stuff. I've got that piece and I have the 2 side irons on the floor, the wheel weights. We'll have the PTO shield and this miscellaneous hardware. It's not much of a batch, but we are in the time of year now where if you get weather that is conducive to painting, you'd best seize upon the opportunity. So I'll finish sanding this PTO shield out tonight and maybe see if I can't round up a few more minor pieces. After that, we'll see you all tomorrow. Just enough rust pits on this PTO shield. We needed to smooth that out a bit. A little bit more and we'll have it. Well, everyone, it's actually been 2 days since you last saw me sanding on the top of the PTO shield, which turned out excellent, by the way. Senior talked me into holding off another day to get a little bit more stuff prepped to round out the paint batch a little bit better, and I'm glad I listened to his advice because, well, that allowed me to get the new clamshell fenders already. And look at this, we can see our reflection. I can see me. It's got some good depth. We're getting that new paint gun dialed right in. I'm super happy with the finish that we got there, and I can even see the pegboard behind me. Yeah, that's a good finish on those. I'm really happy about that. Some of the other parts, of course, the side rails for the engine. This piece is a guard that goes under the transmission right behind the hydraulic pump. Those are the fender extension brackets. I've got 4 racks actually of hardware, nuts, bolts, washers, and our front pedestal, wrapping it up where we started. We're Farmall 300 from the flange on down, but it is going to work just fine on the H, and these parts were all in much better condition than what I took off of this tractor. So here you can see that thrust bearing in there beneath that that felt retainer dust shield, and then everything else that heads on up to the gear quadrant at the top. Oh, and I also got 2 coats of the silver put onto the front rims. The new intertubes for those are due in tomorrow, as are, we got the shop kind of jammed up here. We'll get back over to this side, as are the bushings for the front bolster. So tomorrow is going to be a trip into town so we can start putting front wheels back on rims, and then we'll get into that bolster, start knocking the old seals and the old bushings out. Hopefully the delivery truck brings me my new parts. We can just keep right on rolling. Thank you for watching, everyone. We're trying to cover as much ground as we can as quickly as possible. And as of late, we've been doing pretty well. Hope to see y'all back for the next adventure. Oh, I almost forgot, out of sight, out of mind. Both the front wheel weights are done too.